Everybody, welcome back to the afternoon session. We are going to have two papers this afternoon, followed by a roundtable discussion. So please stay with us. I know it's getting late for some of you in Israel and in Europe. We appreciate sort of your stamina, and I guess coffee is being involved at this moment. So I would like to, the first paper, we will, travel to Germany, to contemporary Germany. It's a paper on AfD, the Alternative for Germany, Anti-Semitism and the pandemic. That's our first paper. And the second paper, we will come back to the United States and we will discuss, we will sort of hear about a paper that covers the four sources of US anti-Semitic events in contemporary United States. And then we will proceed with the roundtable. So let me introduce two speakers for the panel now on the anti-Semitism in Germany in the time of the pandemic. So we are very pleased to have Dr. Petra Guasti with us, who is a lecturer at the Goethe University Frankfurt and a senior researcher at the Institute of Sociology of the Czech Academy of Sciences. In 2018-19, she was a democracy visiting fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research focuses on the reconfiguration of the political landscape and revolves around three themes: representation, democratization, and populism. To date, Dr. Guasti published 13 articles, 19 book chapters, and 1 monographs, and 5 edited volumes. And her research has appeared in many journals, such as Democratization, Communist and Post-Communist Studies, European Political Science, East European Politics and Societies and Cultures, Politics and Governance, East European Politics and Elsewhere. And she's also my very good friend. Thank you for being here. We are very lucky that the Sara Goodman agreed to serve as a discussant. Sara Wallace Goodman is an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine. So we have Jeff Kopstein and Sara Goodman from Irvine here with us. Her research examines democratic citizenship and the shaping of political identity through immigrant integration. She's the author of Immigration and Membership, Politics in Western Europe, and co-author of the forthcoming book, Pandemic Politics. Congratulations. Her work has also appeared in the Journal of Politics, World Politics, Comparative Political Studies, International Organization, and other venues. Sara's research has been also cited in major outlets, such as the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and Vox. Her work has received numerous awards. I will mention one. Her book, Immigration and Membership Politics, was awarded the Best Book Award by the European Politics and Society Association of the American Political Science Association, and she also received numerous awards for her articles. So we are, thank you, Sara, for being here, and I look forward to your thoughts. So Petra will start, and then we will turn to Sara. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenka. Thank you, David, for the invitation and for asking me to look at what is going on in Germany. This is how this paper started. But first and foremost, I want to thank the Lowe family for inviting us and giving us this opportunity. And I want to mention three small points about to kind of set the scene for this paper. So Lenka mentioned that I work at the campus of the Frankfurt University, the Goethe University in Frankfurt. The main building on our campus used to belong to IG Farben, which was the company which produced Cyclone B. So that is important. That is the building I pass every day, but that's not the first building I pass on the way to work every day. I pass two synagogues on the way, and both of them are 24/7 guarded by the German police. They are there if it snows, if it rains, they're there all the time. And for holidays, there is a special protection. And this is the state of Jewish life in Germany. Every Jewish school, every Jewish community center has, according to the state, but mostly in the Western states of Germany, parliament, police protection. So that's important. I mentioned the IG Farben building. It has a permanent exhibition about the war and participation of the company in the Second World War. And as recently as in 2019, when the campus was enlarging, a Second World War unexploded bomb was found in the middle of the campus. And so everybody was evacuated. 150,000 people from Frankfurt were evacuated on Sunday, and the bomb was taken away. I thought that this is important to kind of set the scene for saying that the war is never far away, that the reminders of the war are here, even 70 years after the war have ended. But I think that all of us have a feeling that something has shifted in German politics. And I would argue, and the paper argues, that the major shift in German politics and in German contemporary anti-Semitism is the presence of an anti-Semitic party in the German parliament. The Alternative for Germany didn't start as an anti-Semitic party. It started more, I would use Salzborn's thesis. It started as a party for anti-Semites and turned into an anti-Semitic party. It radicalized in power. And it is because the party was unable to deal with its anti-Semitic elements that over time they actually took over the party. The key grievance, and I think that's also part of the key appeal. So before I say that, I have to say an important point. This is the first party, anti-Semitic radical right party, which entered the German parliament since 1945. So this is why it's a big deal for all of us. It was not exactly a surprise. The party started as a radical right. It had especially Islamophobia is the core. And the relationship between AFD and anti-Semitism and Jews is a complex one, and that's something I try to partially unpack in the paper and make a connection to the, let's say, increased visibility of anti-Semitism during the pandemic. Of course, there I don't have any, I did not do any survey. I definitely did not participate in the demonstration. So it's more a cursory story. But I still think that seeing people wearing a David Star and adopting a David Star, which has in the middle written unvaccinated, or seeing people wearing clothing usually associated with photographs of the concentration camp prisoners in mainstream German media, on television, I think this was a huge shock to the country. I think it was a shock to the country because for a long time it was possible to have like the ostrich head in the sand, and kind of every time there would be a bigger attack on a synagogue, everybody would get appalled, and there would be like 3 days of, oh, we are all shocked, how is it possible? Maybe we need a special parliamentary committee, how are we going to deal with it? And kind of it every time looks the same, but there is never really a major change. And I think that the pandemic was kind of a turning point. It became evident that for part of the society, anti-Semitism is a part of free speech. And while not everybody in those protests was an anti-Semite, they did not mind marching and protesting against the mitigation measures next to anti-Semites. So I think that is a major change. I also mentioned in the paper the increase of hate crimes, and that the majority of them, about 93%, has been ascribed to radical right, and only 7% is splitting between foreign, religious, and left-wing ideologies. And that would also include some Islamic protest. The last point I want to make about AFD and anti-Semitism, which very much spilled into the protests, who were mostly organized by radical right, but not attended only by the radical right. And I think that's important. And it is this complex relationship with partially embracing Jews and presenting itself as the party which protect the Jews against the failed immigration policy of the government. So it's kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the AFD actually organized a whole parliamentary debate about anti-Semitism, where they claimed that they are the only party which fights against anti-Semitism in Germany, because all anti-Semitism is Muslim anti-Semitism, and it would be resolved, there would be no hate crimes if there were no Muslims in the country. So that's kind of their framing. At the same time, there is a strategic and instrumental reason to use this, because if the party is clearly anti-Semitic, it would be scrutinized and surveilled by the state much more, which its elements are, but not the parliamentary party as a whole. So I think that's interesting, and I look forward to the discussion and to Sara's comments. And thank you very much for taking this on, Sara.
So, Sara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the paper. I learned so much from reading it, and I have 5,000 questions that I want to ask you and push you on. So I study immigrant integration, attitudes towards immigrants. So from that perspective, we both look at the AfD, but looking in different directions. I also study kind of what generates local grievance. So we sort of come at this, I'm coming at this from an adjacent field, but they both sit comfortably side by side in how we think about outgroups and how we politicize outgroups. And I found your paper generative, and there are a lot of opportunities here to make exciting contributions. I want to push you in thinking about, you have to make some choices here, like what this paper wants to say. And I see 3 possible outcomes, and then I'm going to throw in a 4th because my mic is unmuted. So the first thing that this paper is about, or could be, is why do pandemics activate anti-Semitic grievance? What role do pandemics serve in legitimation? So centering the pandemic itself. The pandemic was sort of promised as part of this paper. It doesn't appear till much later in the paper. And so I'm actually wondering if there are different things happening in the paper. So the first is really centering the pandemic. So you argue about how anti-governmental protests during the pandemic brought anti-Semitism from the shadows, legitimating it in the public square. Is the AfD the only source here then? Do we need to look at other contributions to this legitimation in the public square? If this is the choice path you take, we want to look at more actors. Who are the people attending the AfD sponsored rallies who aren't members of that party, right? Or who else is feeling legitimated in this new political environment to air grievances publicly? So is the AfD the only source? You spoke about this broader spectrum of participants like police and specific sectors. So maybe looking at these independent from one another, and then sort of how they sort of build on each other's I guess, public statements or legitimation, I think is the term used, right? So what are we seeing from the left and the right, if the pandemic is centered in this story and the activating of anti-Semitic grievances in the public sphere? So the second thing or question that this could be about is, what is the connection between anti-COVID protests, so the anti-government protests, and anti-Semitism? So what is it about rejecting state mandates and anti-Semitism that are linked? You describe this as the politics of misrepresentation. And this, in the current state of the paper, seems what the content is really about. How they both stem from, how both anti-COVID order protests and anti-Semitism stem from misrepresentation as a kind of central tenet of populism. So is the argument here then that anti-Semitism is always high in Germany, but became higher during COVID in that it co-appeared alongside these anti-government protests? You provide data up until 2019 about hate crime count, but not including 2020. So like, is it the co-appearance of the anti-government protests that enabled the kind of public legitimation of this narrative? Or is it that people move to more public displays, as these, so unrelated but simultaneous, or related and simultaneous? So that's kind of the second column, right, that this paper could be about. The first is centering the pandemic. The second is the simultaneity of these anti-government protests. And then the third is really this kind of within case analysis of the AfD and how they have changed their positioning on anti-Semitism from, as you cited, right, being a party of anti-Semites to an anti-Semitic party. And what is it about the pandemic that has created opportunities in this transition? So the third centers the party itself. I'll talk more about this in my comments later, but then we want to think comparatively. Well, is this like the Labour Party that didn't expel its anti-Semites? Like, what are the dissimilarities and differences about how parties treat anti-Semitism internally? And then what is it about pandemic that might shake up that system or reprioritize party practices? And then the fourth, like I said, is not in the paper, but if the focus is on the AfD, then I have to ask, are Jews like immigrants in the pandemic? When does the AfD criminalize Jews versus immigrants? Both, neither. There's a neat sort of a neat comparison there that you could look at discourse, or you could look at protest signs that might tell, who's to blame when and for what. So as it currently stands, the paper argues that anti-Semitism is a type of negative externality of misrepresentation. But I want to push you on that thinking a little bit, because the claims about populism that underscore misrepresentation here, well, I should say, if we're working from a definition of populism and misrepresentation is the chief mechanism by which populist party air their grievances, very sort of festivus language there, then how do the outgroups work into a definition of who the people are, right? This needs a clear specification if you're talking about populism or in the paper or not. So then what is AfD a case of? Is it a typical case for misrepresentation? Is it a most likely case for representation? You sort of backed into the case justification, and I'd encourage you to put that more explicitly up front, especially if you think a comparison is more appropriate. And then at one point you mentioned that as an oppositional party, so this is a part of your case justification, that the AfD is not driving the parliamentary agenda, but we know that they drive it rhetorically. And there's research in political science by Abu Shodi and Krauss most recently that shows that even when far-right parties don't enter government, they still threaten the center-right. And in fact, that they don't just agenda set, but they move these parties to the right programmatically. And that in doing so, those center-right parties actually lose voters to the far right because they appear to be just disingenuous position takers of these far-right anti-immigrant issues, most typically. So I want to encourage you to think about what the AfD is achieving, not just rhetorically, but programmatically when they come out on these anti-COVID positions specifically, and how those are linked to misrepresentation, anti-Semitism, as you argue. And then I should say that what I really just wanted a lot more of, and what I found to be the most interesting part of the paper, was really about how these anti-Semitic and anti-COVID messagings overlap. So does the anti-elitism of this populist message also invoke the anti-Semitism in opposing government orders? How much of that is connected? So I'd love for you to make that paper just about this. Is there a survey data you can draw on? How much of the 20% that oppose COVID measures are also supporters of the AfD? Like where are is this a coalition of people? Is this sort of a real, if we could subset, like who are we talking about? And then, yeah, I think I'll leave my comments there. There's just so many of them. I just really enjoyed the paper. Again, it was really generative, and I look forward to seeing next iterations of it.
So, Sara, thank you very much. I don't see any questions in the Q&A and on the chat. Is there anyone who is not unmuted who would like to ask a question? If not, I'll go to Petra, but I just want to pause. I know, we just had lunch, other people are getting tired.
I just have a quick comment. One thing that I wanted to tie this paper to the previous discussion, it was mentioned, actually, I believe Eyal put it in the comments of Jeff's, was what if Ivanka wasn't Jewish? And so, here it seems like the same strategy is going on, that, the AfD is using Bibi's son and is like sort of saying we are the party that is protecting the Jews as a sort of shield against the charge of anti-Semitism, a disingenuous one, but nonetheless, the strategy seems parallel. So I just wanted to raise that as a possibility.
So I have one more question from the chat. It's from Rabbi Nitzan Stenkokin, who is actually from Germany originally. Oh, and then we'll go to Jeff. And she asks, can you talk about how recent Arab immigration affects new spurs of anti-Semitism in the general German population? So that's from Rabbi Stenkokin, and then Jeff and Eyal have questions too, but you feel free to ask.
So who, me? Okay. Thanks so much, Petra. A really interesting paper. My question is, I want to hear your reaction to, and it's kind of it's an elephant in the room regarding not just this party, but this group of parties. What do we make of their pro-Israel orientation? Of course, I tend to see it through the lens of my own work on the United States. Of these are, anti-Semitic pro-Israel parties, right? And that this goes for Orban and peace in Poland and any number of other these kinds of parties. And I'm just not sure what to make of it. And also within the AfD, how much that position is a dominant position, or could it flip on a dime to being the way Fidesz, elements of Fidesz, could flip on a dime to being, and the way what happened with Jobbik. Jobbik, turned was an anti-Israel party, then a party. Now it's actually a pro-Jewish party. I mean, and one wonders, which raises the second question is, are these views, they may be a mile wide, but are they kind of how deep are they? How committed are they? What are they really committed to? And is the Jewish thing is it very surfacey and not very important? And I, as a Germanist, I'm ashamed that I don't know the answer to those questions. But they strike me as important ones for students of anti-Semitism at any rate.
So now there is Eyal, and then if there are no other questions after Eyal, we'll go to Petra, unless I'm not seeing something.
So Petra, really unbelievable paper, great topic, and I'm really excited to see this develop. I just wanted to say that as somebody who also examines issues around hate and hate crimes, and you brought up the fact that 93% of suspected perpetrators or identified perpetrators in the German context have been connected to right-wing ideology. I'm curious to get your assessment of why that doesn't match what we see from Jews in Germany themselves when they're surveyed on this issue. So when we look at the FRA survey specifically, and they're asking who do you think is responsible for these incidents, we don't see the proportion that associate their victimhood to a right-wing perpetrator nearly that high. So can you just describe what you think is going on with these statistics a bit more? Are they accurate? I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
So Petra, I have one more. It ties back to Jeff's question, and then, but I know you can walk and chew gum at the same time. This is a question from the broader audience, from Ariel Rosenberg, and it speaks about Polish experience right now. So the question is, what is really concerning is the Israeli far right pandering to these elements like law and justice in Poland in exchange for recognizing Poland as a victim rather than a perpetrator of the Holocaust. So it's not a question about the AfD, but I think it speaks sort of to the broader issue of new alliances. So we see in Slovakia, the Slovak National Party, Jobbik, having foreign policy orientations towards Israel that one would not expect, let's say, 10 years ago. So Petra, the floor is yours now.
Thank you. And first and foremost, thank you, Sara. And you are too kind and of course, exactly right. So I never pretended to be a scholar of, so I'm more a scholar of representation and populism. And so that's exactly what I'm interested in. I'm interested in who is included and who is excluded from the people. So who do these parties actually represent? So this was the part on misrepresentation is based on an analysis I did of the parliamentary debates when AfD, when the Alternative for Germany came to the British, to the German parliament. And it was very interesting because every MP, when they start, has the so-called, it's called the virgin speech. So they have, they get 5 uninterrupted minutes, but I think that it's also the defining moment. So from a constructivist point of view, that is where they construct what is our agenda, what is that we are to do here. So I agree, this could be many papers, but I will argue that the best data I have for, and I can really rely on, is the parliamentary debates. And the reason is twofold. And in that answer, I will also answer the kind question by Ayal. So I think the government statistics are absolutely unreliable and deeply flawed. I don't think they mismatch because the way the government is actually counting, the German version of the CIA, which is called the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, is collecting these data and putting them together. But they're deeply flawed. I think they just overcount because they stick into the same bucket symbols sprayed on a synagogue or on a cemetery. I mean, not the violent crimes. The violent crimes are separately, and I think there they really know the perpetrators, but for most of them, they don't. And so they simply don't know who put so just every time putting the Nazi symbol to this bucket, this is why it's overrepresented. What's interesting is that since AfD succeeded on the state level and got into the state level parliament, their agenda, which is coordinated on the federal level, is to actually question these statistics. And paradoxically, that made these statistics better because their aim is to show it's all the Muslims. I think just to answer to when we are at the statistics and at the data, there have been not really a survey studying so I would have something about, so the participants of these protests, Sara, unfortunately were not surveyed. I don't think it would be possible. I mean, we are in the middle of a pandemic. The police is actually getting sick at these protests, not to mention the participants who are at these protests, so they are still able to participate while they are screaming that we are a dictatorship, while all the taxpayers are paying for them to actually have this and enjoy these rights. So there are not really surveys. They are just, so I have tried to find any data I could, and this is as good as it gets. Perhaps it will get a bit better. I think the federal office will have some data, but only on crimes when they put them together. I think February is usually the date when the newest data is published. So it's going to be about the same. So I think that kind of limits my choices on what this paper can actually reliably be on, and that will have to be more on the AFD, and perhaps see how the AFD is changing. I want to, when we are at the data, I will also take the opportunity to answer the second part of Ayal's question. The answer is two. Actually, there are two answers. One answer is nobody really knows, because the statistics, because for what I have said about the statistics. And the second is, I think there is when Sara speaks about outgroups and relationship to the outgroups, actually the most problematic relationship in Germany with an outgroup is the anti-Muslim. So the Islamophobia is much more prevalent than anti-Semitism. And so I think that a lot of these things are especially covered by the media every time when there is a crime committed by a refugee. This is really covered by the yellow press. So I can just tell you I don't know, because I don't know what drives it, but I know that it's really, really salient. But I don't know, it's the chicken and egg. But in the whole number of crimes, I really believe that this is less. But some of the most visible crimes were actually either committed by refugees or by teenagers or young adults with immigration backgrounds. But it's because they get covered so much. I think on a deeper level, what I think it's interesting when you are looking at the survey in the paper, that was quite a good thing of youth, so of a very young adults, and that there I thought it was interesting that actually immigration background played a role in anti-Semitism. Of course, this was small numbers, but it was still significant. So I think that is important there. And I think it has to do, these surveys were done at schools. So I think what is important there is you have to kind of understand the context of how history is taught in Germany. So I never went to a German school because I didn't grow up here, but I actually looked into German history books, and I, as a hobby, asked all my colleagues how did they actually deal with Holocaust. And I think that if you look at increasingly multicultural German society, the way Holocaust is taught, it kind of, these children get, it is a very complex issue. And sometimes I thought, and that's just, that's not really that's more anecdotal evidence, is that you see that actually talking to also my students with a migration background, especially from Turkey, they say it does not concern us. We don't care, we don't bear this guilt. This is not our guilt to carry. It has nothing to do with us. And so it's just complex and multi-layered, but basically it's about the politics of memory. And I think in there it's really important to consider that the main aim of the Alternative for Germany is to kind of make everybody into a victim. So what their main aim is to hijack the idea of the Jewish and of the other victims, especially the LGBT and Roma, and just say that everybody was a victim, that the Germans which were bombed were victims, and they were the only perpetrators were the Nazis. Nobody had any links to them. And I think this is the kind of wars over the politics of memory. And there is this like really, I think, interesting tension between and that brings me back to where I wanted to go, to the populism and anti-establishment, which was super interesting question by Sara. You have to let's say the establishment political elites, every single one of them, every year there are all these speeches. Actually, they will be in 2 days. On Wednesday, on the floor of German Parliament, 27th of January, it's every time a Holocaust survival speeches by everybody. We have historical responsibility. This responsibility doesn't end. This responsibility is part of German identity. And so I would argue that part of this rejection is actually overlapping with this. It's this populist anti-establishment. It's because the establishment is here. I would actually argue that it's not that the populists are actually driving the agenda. It is that they are reacting. And that's what makes them the different in every country, because they are reacting to what is the establishment, how is the establishment defined in that country. And so I think in Germany, in relationship to the topic we are addressing at this workshop, two things are important, and they are cornerstones of German, let's say, politics, and that is the relationship to Israel. So as a part of a German constitution, it's the defense of Israel is a part of a German constitution. I thought it was interesting when I first time came across this being questioned by the AfD in the parliament. So they like, and I think that they understand how huge taboo that is, because they seem to be just like tapping around, but throwing it out to see like a little balloon, how it will do, to say, do the German citizens really know that they would be obliged to defend Israel should anything happen? And I think that is because where the German establishment is standing. Every prime minister in their first speech reaffirms the historical responsibility for the memory and the historical responsibility for Israel. So that is, I think, that is important there. And that brings me to the idea of the relationship with the radical right in Israel and the other radical rights. I think that it's exactly as David has said, it's a useful shield, but it's also a coalition of anti-establishment sources. To answer Jeff's question, I think it's just skin deep. They are reacting to when the ball moves, they are moving. So for 4 years, as long as the topic of immigration was the most salient topic in Germany, every single MP, it didn't matter if they were talking about agricultural subsidies, they would manage to get immigration policy into their speech. If it was about children, they would manage to get, so that was a permanent element of there was a anti-establishment saying the established policy, the government policy is wrong. When the ball has moved, so in the pandemic, this suddenly became a non-topic. And it was interesting that at the beginning of the pandemic, they tried to adapt the anti-immigration policy to the pandemic, saying, well, it's all the Chinese, they have brought it here. But then the borders were effectively closed. So there was no really an immigration, and it kind of didn't work anymore. So nobody would cover it. So I think that they have moved on temporarily to another issue. And I think this is really important to understand. I know that in the party competition literature, there is this that the radical parties are kind of pushing the agenda. But I would really argue that this is a super interesting case, because on anti-Semitism and relationship to Israel, the mainstream parties in Germany are immovable. I mean, they would be against the constitution if they would on both of these issues. So it's interesting that this is an issue on which they cannot move. And so the competition is about framing. But I think, look, Jeff, I mean, looking at these, I mean, the first AFD, it's kind of a collection of guys who didn't make it in the mainstream parties and who in their like latter years managed to make a career. There is like very little which unites them than their really deep hatred to the establishment who did not allow them to fulfill their political ambition. And so this is where they are, and there is very little they stand for. So there is a huge division on economic issues in the alternative for Germany. I mean, part of them is like very much to the left, part of them is very neoliberal. So I think that they only agree on what they don't like. So that was kind of, I think, Ayal, kind of to Ariel, I answered, to Jeff, I hope I did. A little bit on the driving the agenda, and then I also had yeah, on the immigrants. On the immigrants, I think I partially mentioned that. I also want to say that there is an increasing problem with radicalization in mosques. So, and the issue is that for a long time, Germany actually didn't have its own Muslim seminary. I don't know how it's called, but I would call it Muslim seminary. And so all the imams were actually imported from Turkey. And that has proven under Erdogan to be a very bad idea. And so actually the reaction was that there need to be German citizens, Muslim citizens, who would actually study Muslim theology, Islam in Germany at German universities to kind of remain within the boundaries of the constitution. So that's an interesting side effect in this. So yeah, if there's more. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And so there is, I would say, 1.5 question in the Q&A. The 0.5, I think, is a general comment about ethnic composition of Germany. So who are the immigrants to Germany? So I don't know if you know this off the top of the head, but is it fair to say that majority of immigrants to Germany are from Muslim majority countries? So that's a sort of a factual question, comment, but a sort of there's a second comment which has to do with the success of AfD in former Eastern lands, and sort of more specifically the question from Eddie Zilber reads, the fact that the AfD was elected in Thuringia, the part of Germany that was under the Soviets until '89, did this have an impact on their political success? And I think sort of this is actually one more question popped up. This sort of speaks to this broader idea. We talked with Petra about this a lot, that that the AfD, in her study of AfD claims, there are no specific claims to Eastern grievances. So, I mean, that would be sort of fascinating to hear. And there is a question from Ariel Rosenberg in the Q&A. Did conspiracy theories play a role in the rise of the AfD, and if so, to what end? I don't see any other questions. Last call for questions, round two. Okay, Petra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to say on the ethnic composition of the immigrants, I think you need to really distinguish between two groups. One I would call the group of refugees, and that's again something which has been covered a lot by the media. So the almost 1 million refugees which came during the so-called refugee crisis, the majority of them was from Muslim majority countries. But the majority of immigration to Germany is actually from the EU countries. So so I wouldn't necessarily, I think there is more Poles in Germany than there are people coming from Syria. I would say like that. As for the, but I will get you once we are once the next session is underway, I will get you the exact data from the statistical office, the newest data, and I will post them in the chat. So I won't.
Actually, someone just did, but like, feel free to do
Yeah.
it. But thank you, Natalie.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
so this is something which is important. I also want to say that. So what Lenka mentioned about the AFD support. So I mentioned in the paper that the AFD support in general was 12.6, but in the new states, so those which used to be the East Germany, the communist East Germany, was 22.6. The most AFD support is actually not in Thuringia, although that is the most, if you would ask me where is the AFD the strongest, I would tell you in Saxony. But if you would ask me where they are the most, where the anti-Semitic AFD is the strongest, that's Thuringia. So Thuringia is really the hardcore anti-Semitic leaders of the AFD are mostly from Thuringia. On the East Germany, you know what's interesting? That the majority of the MPs who were elected from the East actually did not grow up in the East. So some of them were born there, but they emigrated still under divided Germany. So I don't think they really can even relate to the experience. But what Lenka mentioned, in all my studies of this thousands of pages of the speeches from German Parliament, the transcripts, which I did all by hand, what was really interesting is also what was not there. And there were no specific references to the grievances of East Germans, which is, they are numerous. And it's interesting that there were simultaneously, with the rise of AFD and the so-called refugee crisis, there was also in East Germany a very specific social movement called Pegida, which is the People for the Protection of the West. And that's an anti-Muslim, uncivil society group, which over time spilled also to the West, but its heart is Dresden and Leipzig, and they kind of fused this anti-governmental protests from the pre-communist time, so the protest against communism. They adopted a lot of the symbols and rhetorics, but their main agenda was to prevent Islamization of Germany. So what was really interesting is that most of the grievances, the East grievances, are actually voiced through this group called Pegida, and there has been a very strong attempt to keep these two groups separately. So I would argue with you that most of the people who attend the protests of Pegida every Tuesday are probably voters of AFD, but there was no, let's say, overlap officially. So they were trying officially to stay very much apart, presenting themselves as a civil society. So that I thought was important. And as for the conspiracy theories, yes, the main conspiracy theory I found even in the parliamentary debates was a version of the Great Replacement. So it goes like this. Nobody likes, the real Germans no longer like the mainstream parties. So the mainstream parties are importing the refugees, giving them citizenship. So they are kind of manufacturing voters, which of course is flawed on every possible level, especially on the one that to get German citizenship takes 8 years, and none of the refugees has received citizenship so far. So, but I think what's interesting is that there is a lot of transnational communication, and they're both like working with what is salient historically. So in the pandemic, some of the interesting tropes were kind of around the vaccine. You find out things you didn't know. So for example, now I know that the CEO of Pfizer is a Jew. That's why Israel is getting more vaccines than everybody else. I mean, you know, this is the nature of the conspiracy theories. They kind of provide you all these like connections, pretending to be causal links, which has just are not there, but they're trying to make sense of a very complex world. So the Great Replacement is like their favorite one, but still, again, they are trying to like put their core grievance. The main issue is that the government is betraying the people. How exactly is government betraying the people depends on what is in this moment the most salient issue. They will turn it and twist it. And so simultaneously, the chancellor is defending the Jewish interests, but also being the puppet of the Jewish lobby. So they don't need, but the point is, we are the ones who are trying to kind of make sense of it. For them, they don't care that it's irrational. That is I think part of the magic in it, and part of the attraction. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Petra, very much. We have 8 minutes, 7 minutes left. There was a comment about the comment that you made about training local imams in Germany. Not sure how that relates to AfD, but I don't have any other questions. I'm also happy that we resolved the issue of the who is the largest contributor to immigration to Germany, that we have some facts on the ground. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please, if you're on the panel, you can speak freely or send it to the chat.
I would maybe just to mention on the.
And we will wrap it up. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And I just wanted to mention, you know, I think the same like in United States, the job market looks terrible. But if you have a PhD, recent PhD from Islamic studies, you can be a tenured professor right away. So there has been like, I think that this is something, but I really like, as somebody who's living here, I am really concerned about imams being completely out of control of the government and completely out of bounds of the German constitution, which they don't know, and we don't know what they are providing to the young people who are gathering there. They also travel to Germany on diplomatic passports, so they are like completely out of bounds, and this would be the majority of imams. I think what is also important, there is a lot of preconceived notion about people with of Turkish origins in Germany, and I want to say that although there is the let's say, it's not that all of them are a secularization. Oh, okay. A secularization is an important thing. So about only half of them actually identify as Muslims. Yes.
So there is one last question. I actually think, especially in light of the what we will discuss at 3 p.m., the storming of the US Capitol, and it's partly in your paper, but obviously everybody has access to it. Can you talk about the far right infiltrating the police and military in Germany? I think that's a very important topic, and that will be the last question to you, and then we'll wrap it up. I think it's, thank you, Ariel Rosenberg, for this question.
Thank you, Ariel. That this is one of my favorite questions. So I will tell you. What shocks me is how it shocks everybody. Because if you look at the origin of the German Secret Service in the West and in the East, the roots are, let's say, you know, poison apples don't grow on healthy trees. I would say like that. So a lot of former officers, maybe not the most known one, but the majority was actually they were incorporated into this into police and into the military. I think also, given the '68 experience with the left-wing terrorism in Germany, the right-wing terrorism, right-wing extremism has for many decades been a blind spot of the German Secret Service. Once this started to come out, there was a huge there was a chain over 7 years of radical right killings all around Germany. They were all, because it's federal, so they were each investigated separately, and only quite recently it came out that these were actually connected events, and that it would be important for there to be a federal cooperation. Once the issue of anti-Semitism started to be more salient, because there were several very violent attacks. One of them I tried to briefly describe in the paper. Actually, the statistics started to be collected, and the police and the military was forced to look into their own on their own members, that they are actually engaged in some of these. There is a German version of the 3%ers. They are called the Reichsbürger. They don't believe, it's also partially a conspiracy theory, so they don't believe German state exists. They don't recognize it. They think the Nazi Germany is still continuing. They don't get passports, IDs, driving licenses. They don't recognize the state. They don't pay. Oh, they don't pay like parking tickets and so on. They are highly weaponized and so on. So that is still there, and that has been there for a long time. But I think it has been really in the shadow. It has been a blind spot. There has been several scandals with the secret police having their collaborators and informants infiltrating these groups, but actually not really drawing boundaries. So what do you do if the people who collaborate with you and provide you information actually take part in some of these crimes? So I think there is now really, and it would be only in the last 2 to 3 years that this has become an important topic. And finally, I have 2 minutes, so I want to use the 1 minute to tell you that storming of the Capitol was a copycat, because on 29th of August 2020, we had the storming of the Reichstag in Berlin during the anti-COVID demonstration. They didn't make it inside of the building of the German parliament because there was police, but they made it very near to the building. And on the subsequent days, some of the protesters actually made it to the building, but as guests of the AfD members of parliament. So every member of parliament can bring up to 5 guests a day, and some of them brought these protesters inside. So there was a big discussion of how do you draw the boundary. So there is a lot of overlap between our next session and what is going on in Germany. And thank you for your attention. Thank you again, Sara, for all your reading of the paper. And yeah, thank you.